Judge Clarice Thompson was Oakwood County's moral compass. For 20 years, she presided over its courtrooms, a beacon of unwavering integrity in a system often shrouded in shadows. Her rulings were legendary, not for their leniency, but for their profound sense of fairness, a quality that transcended race, creed, or social standing. She'd sent hardened criminals away with a heavy heart, but an even heavier sentence, always laced with the hope of rehabilitation. She'd dismissed cases against the wrongly accused, her voice ringing with conviction as she championed the underdog. Everyone knew Judge Thompson. She volunteered at the local soup kitchen every Thanksgiving, mentored underprivileged youth, and even quietly funded a scholarship program for aspiring law students from disadvantaged backgrounds. Her commitment to justice wasn't just a job, it was her life's calling. It was this very dedication that made the events of a sweltering Tuesday afternoon all the more shocking. Unbeknownst to Judge Thompson, as she drove home from a long day of hearings, another figure was moving through the same streets, Officer Derek Miller. Miller was a stain on the Oakwood County Police Department. A man with a history of complaints, excessive force, racial profiling, and blatant disrespect, he'd somehow managed to evade serious disciplinary action, protected by a brotherhood of officers who turned a blind eye to his transgressions. He viewed the world through a lens of prejudice, seeing threats where there were none, and wielding his authority as a weapon against those he deemed lesser. His reputation preceded him, whispered in hushed tones in the black community, a constant reminder of the inequities that still plagued their town. He was a powder keg waiting for a spark, and on this day, Judge Thompson's unassuming sedan would be it. The collision course was set, an encounter that would irrevocably alter the lives of both individuals and send shockwaves through the entire community. The flashing blue and red lights appeared in Judge Thompson's rearview mirror, an unwelcome intrusion on her quiet drive home. She signaled, pulled over to the shoulder, and rolled down her window, a sigh escaping her lips. "Just my luck," she muttered, assuming she'd inadvertently drifted over the speed limit. Officer Miller approached, his face already etched with a scowl, his hand resting on his holster. There was no polite greeting, no "License and registration, please." Instead, he barked, "License and registration. Now!" His tone was unnecessarily aggressive, his eyes scanning her car with suspicion. Judge Thompson calmly reached for her purse, her movements deliberate and unhurried. "Officer," she began, "is there a problem?" "Just give me the damn license," Miller snapped, his voice rising. "And keep your hands where I can see them." The judge, though surprised by his hostility, complied, handing over her documents. Miller examined them briefly, then sneered. "Clarice Thompson," he read aloud, emphasizing her first name with a mocking tone. "Well, Clarice, you know why I pulled you over?" "No, officer, I don't," she replied, maintaining her composure. "Don't get smart with me," he snarled, leaning closer. "I saw you speeding back there. You think you're above the law?" He began writing a ticket, his pen scratching furiously against the paper. The air crackled with tension. Judge Thompson decided to remain silent, hoping to de-escalate the situation. But Miller wasn't finished. He seemed intent on provoking her. He continued to make snide remarks, questioning her driving skills and making thinly veiled allusions to her race. The insult stung, but Judge Thompson refused to give him the satisfaction of a reaction. Then it happened. As she reached for her insurance card, Miller, without warning, slapped her across the face. The force of the blows sent a jolt of pain through her head. A gasp escaped her lips. The world seemed to tilt for a moment. Disbelief warred with a searing rage. The humiliation was profound, the injustice palpable. In that instant, the carefully constructed wall of professionalism she had built over 2 decades threatened to crumble. For a long, suspended moment, Judge Thompson simply stared at Officer Miller, her hand instinctively rising to her stinging cheek. The world seemed to hold its breath. Then, the dam broke. "Do you have any idea who I am?" she asked, her voice low and dangerously controlled, a stark contrast to the roaring fury inside. It wasn't a question, it was a statement, laced with the weight of her position and the gravity of his actions. Miller, momentarily stunned by his own audacity, seemed to deflate. The arrogance that had fueled his tirade evaporated, replaced by a flicker of apprehension. He stammered, I don't understand." Judge Thompson straightened her shoulders, her gaze unwavering. "I am Judge Clarice Thompson of the Oakwood County Superior Court. And you, officer, have just assaulted a sitting judge." The color drained from Miller's face. His eyes widened in disbelief, then narrowed in a desperate attempt to salvage the situation. Judge Thompson? I didn't know. I swear I didn't recognize you." The apology sounded hollow, rehearsed, a pathetic attempt to undo the damage he had inflicted. He backpedaled, his voice laced with a false sincerity that was almost comical. "Ma'am, I am so sorry. It was a misunderstanding. A terrible mistake. I thought you were reaching for something." Judge Thompson remained unmoved. "You thought I was reaching for something that warranted striking me across the face?" she countered, her voice dripping with scorn. "That's your excuse, officer? That's what you're going with?" Miller was sweating now, his hands trembling visibly. He fumbled for his radio, his voice cracking as he called for backup. "Dispatch, I need a supervisor at my location. Code 4. He avoided Judge Thompson's gaze, his earlier bravado completely gone. The realization of the consequences of his actions was sinking in, a slow, agonizing burn. The empire he thought he was building, brick by brick on a foundation of prejudice and power, was about to come crashing down around him, all because he slapped the wrong black woman. The arrival of the supervising officer, Lieutenant Davies, did little to ease the tension. Davies, a seasoned veteran with a reputation for playing by the rules, surveyed the scene with a grim expression. He listened to Miller's stammered explanation, then turned to Judge Thompson, his face etched with concern. "Judge Thompson, I am so sorry this happened. Officer Miller will be placed on administrative leave pending an investigation." Back at her home, after a long and uncomfortable meeting with the lieutenant, Judge Thompson wrestled with a difficult decision. The phone hadn't stopped ringing. Her colleagues, fellow judges, and even the chief of police himself urged her to reconsider pressing charges. "Think about your reputation, Clarice," one of her closest friends on the bench pleaded. "This will be a media circus. It could tarnish everything you've worked so hard to achieve. Just let it go. He's already being punished internally." The chief of police was more direct, hinting at the disruption it would cause within the department and the potential for unrest in the community. He offered her assurances of internal reform, promising that Miller would be dealt with severely. But Judge Thompson couldn't shake the image of Miller's sneering face, the sting of his hand against her cheek. It wasn't just about her. It was about all the other black men and women who had been subjected to similar abuse, often without recourse. If she, a sitting judge, could be treated this way, what hope was there for others? The internal conflict raged within her. On one hand, she valued her privacy and her position. A trial would be messy, exposing her to public scrutiny and potentially damaging her standing in the legal community. On the other hand, her conscience wouldn't allow her to remain silent. To let Miller off the hook would be a betrayal of her oath, a tacit endorsement of his actions. She paced her living room, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. Finally, she made her choice. She picked up the phone and dialed the district attorney's office. "I want to file charges," she stated, her voice firm and resolute. "I want to press charges against Officer Derek Miller for assault." The empire she thought she was protecting by staying silent would have to crumble if justice was to be served. The moment the district attorney's office released a statement confirming the charges against Officer Miller, the story exploded. Local news outlets picked it up first, then regional, and finally, national media outlets descended on Oakwood County like vultures. "Racist cop slaps black judge," screamed the headlines. "Judge Thompson files assault charges." The internet went wild. Social media platforms became battlegrounds for heated debates, accusations, and defenses. Almost immediately, the narrative fractured along predictable lines. The black community, long familiar with Officer Miller's reputation, rallied behind Judge Thompson. Protests erupted outside the courthouse and the police station, demanding justice and systemic reform. Civil rights organizations issued statements condemning Miller's actions and calling for a thorough investigation into the Oakwood County Police Department. Supporters created hashtags like #JusticeForJudge Thompson and #BlackJudgesMatter, flooding social media with messages of solidarity and outrage. But there was also a vocal contingent defending Officer Miller. The thin blue line mentality took hold among some members of law enforcement and their supporters. They argued that Miller was simply doing his job, that Judge Thompson was using her position to seek revenge, and that the entire incident was being blown out of proportion. Accusations of reverse racism were hurled, claiming that Miller was being unfairly targeted because he was white. Online forums buzzed with hateful rhetoric, fueled by misinformation and prejudice. The comments sections of news articles became cesspools of vitriol, with anonymous posters spewing racist slurs and conspiracy theories. Some even went so far as to dox Judge Thompson, publishing her address and phone number online, subjecting her to a barrage of threats and harassment. The polarization was stark and unsettling. The town was divided, with neighbors and friends finding themselves on opposite sides of a deeply contentious issue. Judge Thompson, once a respected figure admired by all, now found herself at the center of a raging storm, her reputation and her safety hanging in the balance. The carefully constructed image of Oakwood County as a harmonious community was shattered, revealing the deep-seated racial tensions that had been simmering beneath the surface for years. As the public debate raged, investigative journalists began digging into Officer Miller's past. What they unearthed was a disturbing pattern of racist behavior, a litany of complaints filed against him, and a systematic effort by the Oakwood County Police Department to shield him from accountability. One journalist, Sarah Jenkins from the Oakwood Gazette, painstakingly pieced together Miller's disciplinary record. She discovered at least 5 formal complaints of excessive force and racial profiling, all filed by black residents. In one instance, Miller was accused of using a racial slur during a traffic stop and then physically assaulting the driver. In another, he allegedly fabricated evidence to justify the arrest of a young black man for drug possession. Each complaint had been investigated internally, but none had resulted in any significant disciplinary action. The investigations were often cursory, relying heavily on Miller's version of events and downplaying the accounts of the alleged victims. Jenkins also uncovered a previous incident where Miller had been suspended for a week after making racist comments to a fellow officer, who was also black. However, the suspension was later reduced to a written reprimand, and the incident was effectively buried. She found witnesses, former colleagues and even some current officers, who spoke on the condition of anonymity, detailing a culture of tolerance for racist behavior within the department. They described Miller as a loose cannon, who was protected by a tight-knit group of officers who shared his prejudices. The Gazette published Jenkins' exposé, and it sent shockwaves through the community. The article included excerpts from the complaints, photographs of the alleged victims, and damning quotes from anonymous sources. The evidence was overwhelming. Officer Miller was not just a rogue cop, he was a product of a system that enabled and protected racist behavior. The revelation further fueled the public outcry and put immense pressure on the police department to take action. The carefully constructed facade of a fair and just police force was crumbling, exposing the rot that lay beneath. The focus shifted from a single incident to a systemic problem, and the demand for accountability grew louder than ever. Chief Harold Jenkins, a man who had prided himself on his calm demeanor and carefully crafted public image, found himself squarely in the eye of the storm. The exposé in the Oakwood Gazette forced his hand. He could no longer ignore the mounting pressure from the community, civil rights groups, and even some members of his own department. His initial statement was a masterclass in bureaucratic doublespeak. He expressed deep concern about the allegations against Officer Miller, emphasizing the department's commitment to fairness and equal justice for all. He announced that Officer Miller would remain on administrative leave pending the outcome of the criminal investigation. He carefully avoided any mention of Miller's past disciplinary record or the systemic issues within the department. He framed the incident as an isolated event, the actions of a single rogue officer, rather than acknowledging the deeper problems that had allowed Miller's behavior to persist for so long. The statement was met with widespread condemnation. Civil rights leaders denounced it as a whitewash and a pathetic attempt to protect the department's image. Protesters intensified their demonstrations, chanting slogans demanding Chief Jenkins' resignation and calling for a complete overhaul of the police department. Even some of Jenkins' own officers expressed disappointment, feeling that he was not taking the allegations seriously enough. Faced with the escalating public outcry, Chief Jenkins was forced to backtrack. He held a second press conference, his tone noticeably more contrite. He announced that he was launching a comprehensive internal investigation into Officer Miller's past conduct and the handling of previous complaints against him. He appointed an independent review board, composed of community leaders and legal experts, to oversee the investigation and make recommendations for reform. He even apologized to Judge Thompson, albeit in a carefully worded statement that stopped short of admitting any wrongdoing on the part of the department. It was a calculated move, designed to appease the public and salvage his own reputation. But whether it would be enough to quell the storm remained to be seen. The cracks in the department's foundation were widening, and the pressure was mounting for real, substantive change. Despite the intense pressure and the online harassment, Judge Thompson found herself receiving unexpected support from various corners of the community. Reverend Elijah Johnson, a prominent civil rights activist and leader of the local NAACP chapter, became one of her most vocal advocates. He organized rallies, gave impassioned speeches, and used his platform to amplify Judge Thompson's voice. He reminded the community of her long history of fairness and justice, urging them to stand by her during this difficult time. Maria Rodriguez, a community organizer and advocate for police reform, also emerged as a key ally. She worked tirelessly to connect Judge Thompson with other victims of police misconduct and to raise awareness about the systemic issues within the Oakwood County Police Department. She helped organize town hall meetings where residents could share their experiences and demand accountability. Perhaps the most surprising support came from within the police department itself. A group of officers, disgusted by Miller's actions and the department's complicity, secretly reached out to Judge Thompson, offering to provide her with information and support. They risked their careers to expose the truth, sharing internal documents and providing testimony about the culture of racism and impunity within the department. Officer David Carter, a young black officer who had witnessed Miller's behavior firsthand, became a particularly valuable source of information. He provided details about the department's internal investigations and the efforts to cover up Miller's past misconduct. These unexpected alliances gave Judge Thompson the strength and courage to continue fighting for justice. She realized that she was not alone, that there were people from all walks of life who believed in her and were willing to stand with her against injustice. The empire that was crumbling wasn't hers, but rather the corrupt system that had allowed Officer Miller to abuse his power for so long. The Oakwood County Courthouse was transformed into a media circus as the trial of Officer Derek Miller began. Reporters from across the country crammed into the courtroom, their cameras flashing and microphones jostling for position. The atmosphere was electric, charged with anticipation and tension. Judge Thomas Abernathy, a respected but somewhat conservative judge from a neighboring county, presided over the proceedings, carefully maintaining order in the chaotic environment. The prosecution's case rested heavily on Judge Thompson's testimony. She took the stand with grace and composure, her voice clear and unwavering as she recounted the events of that fateful afternoon. She described Miller's escalating aggression, his disrespectful language, and the unprovoked slap that had sent her world reeling. She maintained her dignity throughout, refusing to be baited by the defense attorney's aggressive questioning. The defense strategy centered on discrediting Judge Thompson, portraying her as an angry, entitled black woman who was using her position to exact revenge on a police officer. They questioned her driving record, suggesting that she was prone to speeding and reckless behavior. They attempted to paint her as a liberal activist with an axe to grind against law enforcement. They even brought up past cases where she had ruled against the police department, insinuating that she had a bias against them. However, the prosecution presented a compelling case, bolstered by the testimony of Officer David Carter, who bravely testified about the culture of racism within the police department and the efforts to protect Officer Miller. They also introduced evidence of Miller's past disciplinary record, highlighting the numerous complaints of excessive force and racial profiling that had been filed against him. The jury was presented with a stark choice: believe the word of a respected judge, or side with a police officer with a long history of misconduct. The courtroom became a battleground for truth and justice, with the fate of Officer Miller and the reputation of the Oakwood County Police Department hanging in the balance. The jury deliberated for 3 long days, their silence amplifying the tension that gripped Oakwood County. Finally, on the afternoon of the 3rd day, the word spread: a verdict had been reached. The courtroom was packed to capacity, with anxious faces filling every seat and lining the walls. Judge Abernathy called the court to order, his voice echoing through the hushed room. The jury foreman, a middle-aged woman with a weary expression, stood and delivered the verdict. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Derek Miller, guilty of assault." A collective gasp swept through the courtroom. Some wept openly, others cheered, while still others sat in stunned silence. Judge Thompson, sitting in the front row, closed her eyes for a moment, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. It wasn't a victory for her, but a victory for justice, for accountability, for all those who had been victims of police misconduct. Officer Miller, who had maintained a stoic facade throughout the trial, visibly paled as the verdict was read. His lawyer put a comforting hand on his shoulder, but it was clear that the weight of the moment had crushed him. Outside the courthouse, a jubilant crowd erupted in cheers, chanting Judge Thompson's name and waving signs demanding police reform. The verdict was seen as a turning point, a sign that the tide was finally turning against police brutality and racial injustice. However, the celebrations were tempered by the knowledge that the fight was far from over. The verdict was just one battle in a larger war against systemic racism and police misconduct. There were still many more reforms that needed to be implemented, many more victims who needed to be heard, and many more officers who needed to be held accountable. But for that day, at least, there was a sense of hope, a belief that justice could prevail, even in the face of overwhelming odds. The empire built on prejudice and impunity had suffered a significant blow, and the possibility of a more just and equitable future seemed a little bit closer. The guilty verdict against Officer Miller triggered a series of significant changes within the Oakwood County Police Department. Chief Harold Jenkins, whose initial response to the incident had been widely criticized, found himself facing mounting calls for his resignation. The Independent Review Board, established in the wake of the scandal, issued a scathing report, concluding that the department had failed to adequately address the numerous complaints against Officer Miller, and that a culture of tolerance for racist behavior had been allowed to fester. Faced with the overwhelming evidence of systemic failures, Chief Jenkins had little choice but to step down. His resignation paved the way for a major overhaul of the police department, led by a new, reform-minded chief, Maria Sanchez, who had a proven track record of promoting diversity and accountability. Chief Sanchez immediately implemented a series of sweeping changes, designed to address the root causes of the problems within the department. She established new training programs focused on de-escalation techniques, implicit bias awareness, and cultural sensitivity. She also strengthened the department's internal affairs division, giving it the resources and authority to investigate allegations of misconduct thoroughly and impartially. Perhaps most importantly, Chief Sanchez implemented new accountability measures, making it easier for citizens to file complaints against officers and ensuring that those complaints were properly investigated. She also established a civilian oversight board, giving community members a greater role in overseeing the police department and ensuring that it was responsive to the needs of the community. The changes were not universally welcomed, with some officers resisting the new training programs and accountability measures. However, Chief Sanchez remained steadfast in her commitment to reform, determined to create a police department that was truly fair, just, and accountable to all members of the community. The empire of unchecked power and impunity was slowly but surely being dismantled. Judge Clarice Thompson's actions had a ripple effect that extended far beyond Oakwood County. She became a symbol of courage and resilience, an inspiration to those who had been silenced and marginalized by a system that often seemed stacked against them. Her story resonated with people across the country, sparking conversations about race, policing, and the need for systemic reform. While she initially faced criticism and harassment, Judge Thompson's unwavering commitment to justice ultimately earned her widespread respect and admiration. She received numerous awards and accolades, including the prestigious Champion of Justice award from the American Bar Association. She was invited to speak at conferences and universities, sharing her experiences and advocating for reforms within the criminal justice system. Her influence extended beyond the legal community. She became a mentor to young people, particularly those from disadvantaged backgrounds, encouraging them to pursue their dreams and to fight for a more just and equitable world. She established a foundation to support victims of police misconduct and to promote educational opportunities for underprivileged youth. Her actions also inspired other judges and legal professionals to speak out against injustice and to challenge the status quo. She demonstrated that it was possible to be both a respected member of the legal establishment and a vocal advocate for reform. The long-term impact of her actions was profound. The Oakwood County Police Department became a model for other police departments across the country, implementing similar reforms and striving to build stronger relationships with the communities they served. The incident also led to increased scrutiny of police misconduct and a greater emphasis on accountability within the criminal justice system. Judge Thompson's legacy was one of courage, justice, and unwavering commitment to making the world a better place. The empire she inadvertently helped to crumble was replaced by a system that was, at least in some small way, more fair, more just, and more equitable for all. For Derek Miller, the consequences of his actions were devastating and irreversible. He was sentenced to 2 years in prison, a relatively light sentence, but one that felt like a lifetime behind bars. He lost his job, his pension, and his reputation. He became a pariah, ostracized by his former colleagues and shunned by his community. In prison, Miller found himself isolated and alone. The thin blue line that had once protected him seemed to have vanished, leaving him to face the consequences of his actions without the support of his former allies. He was subjected to taunts and threats from other inmates, many of whom were black men who had been victims of police misconduct. His previously held beliefs about impunity were shattered. He had always believed that he was above the law, that he could get away with anything because he was a police officer. But now, he was just another inmate, subject to the same rules and regulations as everyone else. The power and authority he had once wielded were gone, replaced by a sense of helplessness and despair. Whether Miller experienced genuine regret is a matter of debate. Some who knew him believed that he remained unrepentant, convinced that he had been unfairly targeted and that Judge Thompson was to blame for his downfall. Others believed that he eventually came to recognize the error of his ways, acknowledging the pain and suffering he had caused. Regardless of his internal state, Miller's life was irrevocably changed. He had lost everything: his freedom, his career, his reputation, and his sense of self-worth. He became a cautionary tale, a symbol of the consequences of prejudice, abuse of power, and the belief that one is above the law. The empire he had tried to build on a foundation of racism and impunity had crumbled, leaving him with nothing but the bitter taste of regret and the harsh reality of his own actions. The Derek Miller case was not simply the story of one bad cop. It was a symptom of a much deeper, more insidious problem, a corrupt system that allowed racist behavior to flourish within the Oakwood County Police Department. Several factors contributed to this toxic environment. First and foremost was the culture of silence. Officers who witnessed misconduct were often reluctant to speak out, fearing retaliation from their colleagues and superiors. The thin blue line mentality, the unwavering loyalty to fellow officers, trumped any sense of ethical responsibility. This culture of silence allowed officers like Miller to operate with impunity, knowing that their actions would be protected by their colleagues. Second was the lack of accountability. The department's internal affairs division was woefully understaffed and underfunded, making it difficult to thoroughly investigate allegations of misconduct. Even when complaints were investigated, the process was often biased in favor of the officers, with little weight given to the testimony of the alleged victims. This lack of accountability sent a clear message to officers that they could get away with anything, as long as they remained within the bounds of the thin blue line. Third was the presence of implicit biases within the police force. Many officers, consciously or unconsciously, held negative stereotypes about black people and other minority groups. These biases influenced their interactions with members of the community, leading to discriminatory policing practices, such as racial profiling and excessive force. These biases were often reinforced by the department's training programs, which failed to adequately address issues of race and cultural sensitivity. The empire of corruption was built on these pillars, each one reinforcing the others and creating a system that was inherently unfair and unjust. The story of Judge Clarice Thompson and Officer Derek Miller is a complex and nuanced one, filled with moments of both despair and hope. It is a reminder that the struggle for racial justice is far from over, that the fight against systemic racism and police misconduct requires constant vigilance and unwavering commitment. While the empire of corruption within the Oakwood County Police Department was dismantled, the seeds of prejudice and bias still linger. The reforms implemented by Chief Sanchez were a step in the right direction, but they are not a panacea. The culture of silence, the lack of accountability, and the implicit biases that allowed Officer Miller's behavior to persist for so long are deeply ingrained and will require sustained effort to eradicate. Judge Thompson's story is a testament to the importance of courage, perseverance, and holding those in power accountable. She could have remained silent, protected her reputation, and allowed Officer Miller to escape justice. But she chose to speak out, to fight for what was right, even at great personal cost. Her actions inspired others to do the same, creating a movement for change that transformed the Oakwood County Police Department and beyond. The struggle for racial justice is a marathon, not a sprint. There will be setbacks and disappointments along the way. But as long as we remain vigilant, as long as we continue to challenge injustice, and as long as we have the courage to speak out against wrongdoing, we can create a more just and equitable world for all. The empire of prejudice may crumble, but the fight for equality must continue, fueled by the hope that one day, justice will truly prevail. Let us remember the lessons learned from Oakwood County, and let us strive to build a society where everyone is treated with dignity and respect, regardless of their race or background. The end.